Well, in the past few video blog issues, we've talked about how to promote safety as a core value instead of a high priority. And we've looked at why it's important to view safety in that way. Remember that as an individual, if a principle or ideal is imposed upon me externally, I'm not likely to embrace it as my own. I may very well comply with it under normal circumstances, but it doesn't command my full commitment because it never quite makes it beyond the level of external priority. And because of that, there's really nothing inherent in that ideal or principle to motivate me to comply with it if there's pressure to comply with a competing priority. But if instead I catch it, remember this is something that's caught, not taught, and I thereby embrace it as my own, it then becomes internalized and part of my makeup. It becomes a value and a belief that I hold. And then when I'm in a situation that forces me to choose between safety on the one hand and some high urgent priority on the other, well, there's no contest because one's a priority, the other's a belief and a value that I hold. And we left that thought by asking the question, how do we get other people, individuals, to embrace safety as their own core value? We've already talked about a number of ways to do this. We know, for instance, that we have to tie it to other core values and beliefs they already hold. And we have to make the connection for them. And we have to change the way we communicate safety, the way we coach safety, and the way we lead safety. We talked about all that in prior videos. What I want to show you now is how to pull all those pieces together and make them work for you. So I'll start by showing you an overview of a multi-step process that I typically use when I work with a client to improve their safety culture. Let's assume for the sake of this scenario that we've already conducted the necessary pre-assessments. We've done the interviews with the client group. We've conducted the gap analysis. We've taken the temperature of the client. Now we have a picture of their safety climate and the issues they're facing, their pain points, their goals, and the obstacles to those goals. Let's assume all that's in place. What happens next? Well, the process itself is tailored to each client we work with. No two implementations look exactly alike, but they are built and executed on the same four basic principles. And it's important to see what those principles are before we begin working our way through the process. So let's take a look at them. Number one, it has to be values-based. Now, we've talked an awful lot about this already, so I don't want to rehash ground we've already covered. But it's important to know that any process or program that you put together for this has to touch the individual at the core value, core belief level. Otherwise, it's not going to be sustainable over the long haul. Number two, it has to be performance-based. You can't simply have a training session. I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the details of this process. But training by itself is not development. And if all they're doing is going through a training session where they're capturing the vision and then taking it back out to their own worlds, you may see a performance boost initially. Typically that's what happens. People go through a workshop or a training session, they get a lot of great ideas, and they want to try them out. So they get back to the workplace and they begin trying out the new things that they've learned. But in short order, real life takes over. Deadlines come up, the pressures of the job kind of take over, they take precedent, and people that have gone through the classes, all those are good ideas they've learned, tend to put those on the shelf for the time being because it's just easier to default to the old way of doing things they're familiar with already. And if they do that, they never quite get back to what it was they were doing before. So you may see an initial performance boost after a training session that typically wanes after a few months if there's no reinforcement of those concepts out in the field. And so it has to be performance-based. There has to be a development process. Number three, it needs to be outcomes-based. You don't just want to throw a program out and try it out for size. That's how flavors of the month come about, and that's how people become cynical with new programs that you might roll out. So whatever you're rolling out needs to have some kind of backing. It needs to have some kind of historical data that it works. Number four, it has to be sustainability based. Whatever program or process you put together has to have a component that builds capability into the organization that you're working with. So it needs to build capability into the EHS organization so that they can continue running the program long after you've ridden off into the sunset. It needs to build capability into operations so that they can continue the program long after you're gone. With these 4 cornerstones in place, we can be sure that whatever program or process we build is set on a rock-solid foundation for longevity. So what does the process actually look like? Well, as I said before, the process is tailored to each implementation. There are no 2 that look exactly alike. But there is a template that we follow as sort of a process infrastructure. And that template typically includes the same 5 steps in each case. And so I want to give you an overview of what those 5 steps are, and then kind of flesh those out in subsequent video blogs that we do on this. Step number 1 is safety leadership training. The goal of the training is to impart a new vision about safety, what do we think and believe about it, as well as to build some basic skills around leading a safety culture. We typically target operations leadership, engineering, production, maintenance, EHS. Ultimately, we'll get around to including the corporate side in this as well in a subsequent step. Step number 2 is process stewardship training. Here we're targeting primarily the EHS group, any safety committees, any safety excellence committees that exist, or anyone else who has taken an active role in leading safety in the organization. Here we want to build some additional skills in those that are ultimately going to be leading this program after we've handed it off to them. Step 3 is field coaching development. Here's where we go out and do performance coaching to reinforce the skills that they've learned in the workshop and to develop those skills into a competency. Step 4 is corporate integration. I've already kind of mentioned this one. Eventually, we'll want to get to the point where we're integrating the corporate side into this culture change as well, because it's not a true culture change unless the entire organization is part of it. And then step number 5 is ownership handoff. Once we're sure we've built capability into the program stewards and they're comfortable leading the program on their own, we then officially pass the mantle to them. Well, these are the high-level components, and there are some other things that we may or may not include in the process depending on the implementation. Also keep in mind that there are other things that we always do in the background to ensure success, such as working with executive leadership and driving the change management process. And we'll talk about those things as well, but we'll save those for another series.